Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari, and today we have two special guests with us. First, we have Mr. Peter MacIsaac back with us. How are you doing, Peter?
Happy to be back, Payman. Lots to talk about, buddy, that's for sure.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. Just by brief introduction, Peter, he's a firefighter. He's helping out with Independent Nova Scotia, and he's the author of Redneck Conservative, How Conservatives Are Made. I recommend you go check it out. The link to the Amazon page is in the description. And we also have with us the Remanded, or Rem for short. How you doing?
Pretty good. Hanging in there.
Rem, you value your anonymity, so we're going to skip over your bio.
Yeah, well, there's some things I've talked on. Yeah, I'm just an average family guy, 3 kids, couple dogs, a mortgage and investment, and I'm a carpenter by trade. So, I'm just your average citizen, kind of just doing your civic duty,
Sounds good. So we got 2 average citizens and a computer nerd. So, Peter, last time you were on, you were talking about what was going on in Nova Scotia with the upcoming election, with the premier potentially panicking because you had a really good strategy to run independents. And now that the election's over, can you give us just a brief update of what you went through and then recap of what's going on right now?
So we have 1.1 million population here in Nova Scotia with 55 seats to fill. The Progressive Conservative Premier, his first piece of legislation he passed in Nova Scotia was a set election date. And that set election date was for July 2025. And the Independent Nova Scotia Initiative, we set out on a mission from coast to coast Nova Scotia to go into communities and educate them and have the communities find 55 independent candidates to run an independent in every riding in Nova Scotia in the upcoming provincial election. And for the first time, we had set election dates, and we said, well, we can accomplish that goal. Well, apparently we were nipping a little too hard at the Premier's heels, and he broke his word to everybody in Nova Scotia and called a snap election. And in that snap election, there's a lot of questionable things that happened. One of them is he ended up with what's called a supermajority, and he can actually go in and even change the rules of the House now. And so we launched an emergency motion with the Nova Scotia courts 5 days before the election to get the election squashed or quashed. And we couldn't get a court date until yesterday. So yesterday was our first appearance in front of a Supreme Court judge to deal with what we believe the illegality of the recent election. Now, a couple of other things happened on that, but I'll give you the rest of the details, those later. But that's basically and what we considered to be an illegal election was called. And it was not just called because we were biting at his heels. There was an ongoing criminal investigation that was requested inside Elections Nova Scotia for keeping an independent off the ballot in a by-election back in May. And in order to make sure the public didn't find out about that election or that court case, they were jammed into a corner of having to call an early election and dissolve the legislature so that investigation couldn't find its way into the public prior to an election.
Right. Why was he kept off the ballot, that one?
So the issue we have in Nova Scotia, all across Canada, there's varying pieces of legislation in order to be able to run as a candidate. We had roughly 20 candidates that wanted to run in this election, but the trial balloon for us with the independents was an independent in a by-election in May who wanted to run. And he became a registered candidate, but when it came time to submit his signatures and his payment, he also had to, according to there's conflicting legislation in the province. One piece of legislation says that you don't need an auditor to become a registered candidate, but you do need an auditor an auditor who's qualified to do not an auditor, but a CPA qualified to do audits on elections. And you have to be able to name that person on your nomination papers. But there's a section of the Act, the Election Act, that says you only have to name a person on your nomination papers if you had appointed a auditor prior to being registered. And none of the independents were able to acquire the services of auditors here in Nova Scotia to represent them. So what happened was is Elections Nova Scotia put a market barrier violating Section 3 of the Charter in front of somebody getting their name on a ballot. So what happened is that person was defined himself as an injured party. He wasn't able to get his name on the ballot. And he went to our Department of Justice and asked for a criminal investigation into the matter because they, in a coordinated effort over 6 days, the Commissioner of Elections Nova Scotia and the Chief Financial Officer on a daily basis turned him down flat every time he went in to submit his papers saying, no, you still are required to have an auditor. And he would refer to the section of the Act that is not required. And so it was still up in the air, and we were trying to get this settled in court. And that person's name is Bobby Lee Dillman. Bobby actually requested the chief prosecutor in the Department of Justice, Nova Scotia, to do an investigation. And they're obligated by law to do that. But the chief prosecutor didn't respond. A week later, a letter was sent to our Minister of Justice, Barb Adams, and Barb Adams didn't respond. And 7 days later, nobody had responded. Nobody had done their fiduciary obligations. And the Premier called an early election. And what anybody watching the show needs to realize is that Elections Nova Scotia set up a meeting 3 days before the election was called with Bobby Lee Dillman, the Greaves Party, and said, how can we fix this? And he said, well, in order to fix it, you're going to have to fire the commissioner, fire your CFO, and then you're going to have to declare the by-election as invalid, and we'll have to go back to the polls again. Not the polls, but we'll have to go back and run another election. And so what happened was the government was put in between a rock and a hard place. They didn't want Nova Scotians to know that this investigation was going on because it would cast a serious shadow of doubt over Elections Nova Scotia, who was bringing in some new digital equipment manufactured in China to help with our early election process. And at the same time, the last thing the Premier wanted was 55 independent candidates running in the upcoming election. So that's what we're in court about now. So we have a couple of major issues. One is we don't believe that this current election was legal in all aspects, and we may lose that case. But the next thing is there's legislation inside the Election Act that actually throws up barriers to independence. I don't know how it works in BC. I think I have a pretty good idea, but here in Nova Scotia, you're not allowed to form an electoral association prior to the writ being dropped. Any other candidate for any party, they have associations, they raise money, they issue receipts, for donors. Well, an independent's not allowed to do that in Nova Scotia. They're not allowed to have an electoral association prior to the writ. And so you only got 30 days to form an association, start raising money. At that point, you can issue receipts. But the other disadvantage to independents in Nova Scotia, for example, if they raised $100,000 and only spent $20,000, at the end of the election, the province takes that leftover $80,000 from you and puts it into general revenue. They just take your money. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So Section 3 of the Charter has already been decided in a Supreme Court case in Ontario. And you can't put roadblocks that are based on a market availability, because we called all 142 available auditors off a list, and not one of them was willing to represent any of the independents. So straight up, that's a charter challenge that we're pretty much 100% confident we'll win. Some of the other election things are overturning the election, not so much, but the bottom line is we're not going to take it sitting down. And as a result of all these independents not being able to run, we had a 10% lower, record-breaking low voter turnout, the lowest voter turnout, I think, maybe in provincial history. It was down 10% from the last election, which took place during COVID.
So a couple of questions before we go to remanded. What was it? Just that the independents didn't have time, or they were demoralized because they couldn't find this accountant? That some of them either didn't run or didn't win, or was there anything else? Like, were any disqualified this election?
Yeah, we were actually we had nine, possibly I think it's nine minimum that were officially turned down by Elections Nova Scotia, where they became a registered candidate, put their paperwork in, and then got turned down. We had another nine, as many as 11. We have a Freedom of Information request right now into Elections Nova Scotia to get the definitive data, but we had at least another nine that had. That wanted to run. A number of them became registered, but they found out that we were all getting, everyone was getting the boot. Nobody was getting through the process. And so they quit halfway through the process because it was a waste of time, because they still had, a couple of days worth of work to get done, to get on the ballot. And once people started getting their official rejections, they said, well, there's no point. This is extremely, what's the word? Unfair, I believe, is the term that was kicked around the most. And so what happened is we had tens of thousands of people looking for independents to show up on the ballot, and throughout the election, they just weren't there. There was two people that made it through. I believe there was one independent won their seat, but she had been kicked out of the Conservative Party a number of years ago during COVID. And in the last election, I think she won by 62%. And this election, she won by a smaller margin, but she actually won back-to-back as an independent, proving that the independent concept will work here. And then we had another party that needed 10 candidates in order to be able to keep their official status, and they couldn't get them. I think it was called Nova Scotia United. And so that party collapsed, and Election Nova Scotia withdrew their ability to run as a party. And two people who were going to run for them, because they had access to an accountant for their party, they were able to get their name on the ballot, but they got wiped out. They didn't have a game plan. They didn't have the team behind them. They had none of the things in place that we were teaching as we traveled all around the province that were required to succeed at running independents. So we kind of got chopped off at the knees, and I guess now we're going to court, and we'll let the mountain of evidence that we have speak for itself.
So, Remanded, I promise this is the last question. We'll get to you. I can't tell, Peter, if you're exhausted or if you're like one tough SOB and this doesn't phase you out. But this sounds like this sounds constitutional, like a constitutional violation, what they're doing. My question is, the original 9 that got disqualified, do you know why they got disqualified?
Yeah, everybody got qualified. There's a section under the act that says you have to put the name of an auditor on your nomination papers. But there's a later section in the act that says you only have to provide an auditor if you had appointed one prior to becoming a registered candidate. Well, they were all registered candidates who hadn't appointed auditors prior to becoming registered. So they weren't required to put the name of an auditor on their nomination papers. Right. So what ended up happening, even though everybody, it was up in the air, that's what we were trying to get determined, the legality of it they've done prior to the election. And that's why the premier, one of the reasons that he called an election early, because if we knew that would very likely be ruled in our favor, and then that opened the door wide open to our 55 candidates running. And so what the people of Nova Scotia need to realize is, for the thousands and thousands of people that wanted to vote independent, that was stolen from them by the premier, straight up. And so we'll let the court decide, in a charter challenge as to whether or not we had an undue burden placed on us in order to be able to run as a candidate down here in Nova Scotia. And we're 100%, actually 100% confident we'll win this case.
Good to hear. Remanded, let's go over to you. So I didn't mention this at the beginning, but Remanded is here in BC, and he's been following the BC elections. I'm not going to even attempt to explain what you've done. I'll botch it. So why don't you go ahead and tell us?
Well, I just want to say to Peter, that's pretty shocking. But it just seems like the shenanigans technicalities and things that they can just get away with. The one nice thing for your side is that at least you can get it into court and you've made that move. For us in BC, I mean, nobody's touched anything. It's just some, I have two or three other people that I'm working with, trying to move the needle, do FOI requests, for freedom of information requests and whatnot, just hoping to, scare something out to just confirm or prove the stuff that we've been seeing. Maybe I'll land that point on this, and I'm pretty sure this is the case, that the chief electoral officer, he doesn't actually have to uh, actually agree or follow through with any freedom of information requests we submit in BC. So that was concerning to find out. On the financial side, with the agents, I was getting into that a little bit late, but I did notice that independent candidates in BC, well, I think all parties or all candidates would need a financial agent in order to be submitted. So that seems to be a very fine point for you guys, especially being in Nova Scotia, where you concluded that there just wasn't the availability, which is, you know,
Well, I need to clear that up, Bram.
yeah.
Okay, so we all had agents. Everybody that was running had agents and signatures. But the difference is they require we have over 4,000 chartered accountants in Nova Scotia, but only 142 of them are licensed to audit electoral campaigns. That's where the market barrier was put in place to keep independents off the ballot. The parties all had existing agreements with auditors. And of the 142 we contacted, they, at least 50% of them said we have a conflict of interest. The other half said we flat out don't want to do it because Election Nova Scotia is going to do an audit anyways. And the auditors also said, down here in Nova Scotia, we're not against being audited, but there's a section in the act that says you do not require an auditor unless you take in over $5,000 in donations. And everybody that we talked to around the province, we had initially planned to sidestep that requirement because nobody down here was going to drop more than $2 to $3 grand on a campaign. You could pick up 200 election signs down here for $1,000, and then for another $1,500 run a complete campaign on YouTube and Facebook and TikTok and X. And so nobody, even if they had provided them, was going to end up needing one. So everybody had agents, everybody had their signatures, everybody had the money required, and repeatedly Elections Nova Scotia refused them. And like I said, when it comes to a charter violation, we're going to find out it's straight. And I'll tell you the reason why. We went all across Canada and looked at what all the other provinces did. Newfoundland, for example, actually has a section in their act, because they know how hard it is to find these auditors, that if you can't find one, the commissioner of elections, Newfoundland, can appoint somebody else to be an auditor for you. And Nova Scotia has no such rule. Everything is set up in Nova Scotia to keep independents off the ballot.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for clearing that up. That's, yeah, it's just more of, I don't know. it's just really disconcerting. But yeah, I guess for the BC side of things, it's kind of hard to know where to start. There's so much. Maybe, and someone alluded to it. It was like maybe I should start backwards. So when I was looking through the BC election policy and the act, the biggest changes happened in 2019, 2020, when there was a switch of the chief electoral officer and parties, from Liberal to NDP, and it was the biggest change within 25 years where they brought in all this stuff 1 year prior to COVID. But maybe I won't quite go into that. But when I was looking into Section 12, because one of the things that I've noticed is that my 11 inquiries that I sent out to Elections BC and the Investigations Department of Elections BC, which when I made phone calls, that's where they forwarded me to submit because they didn't know what I was talking about, which was basically just adding numbers. Um, they only responded to one of those 11 requests. And so when I was going through the act just this past week, it actually shows that the chief electoral officer is must notify complainants to whether or not an investigation would happen, or basically what the result was to my inquiries, as long as they weren't frivolous or unfounded. The emails that I sent to them had screenshots, they had references, they had everything, and everything that I pulled off for everybody listening, everything that I referenced or pulled from was from Elections BC. You know, it's not something I made up, it's not a conspiracy theory. Everything that I counted, tracked, screenshotted, referenced was off of Elections BC. So if that's the case, then I can't really be wrong.
Remanded.
Yeah.
Maybe if we could start with what was your finding? Like, was it they're throwing out votes, they introduced votes, they swapped votes?
Well, I mean, at the start, like when it first started, we were or it was on a stream, and they were just missing 5,488 votes. So that was the first sign. So when we were on live stream, it was like 11:45 p.m. and Wogpog, another account on Twitter, was just like, oh, I saw this tweet about a DDoS attack on Elections BC's website. But that was never reported, that was never confirmed. But the person that did the reference to a DDoS or the test on his website showed the website Elections BC and showed basically high traffic. So it could have just been high traffic because it was late and everybody was looking to see what was going on with the election. So we didn't really dive into that a lot. But what that did mean was that we need to start looking at the count. We need to start looking at the results. And he was like, start screenshotting. So I just started screenshotting and we started counting. I was like, well, maybe I'll count the 9 categories, which is basically all the parties, all the independents, and I'll just count the numbers and just see if they add up. And they didn't. They were 5,488 votes short. And then when the news coverage ended at midnight, 1 minute later, the Green Party had deducted 2,063 votes from the Green Party. And I was just like, oh man, right off the bat, you've got over 7,000 discrepancies right there. And so it was basically just watching the results page refresh every 3 minutes. It was seeing what their social media, which we caught them into a lie. They put out this social media post stating that they were only going to be counting for another hour in these 16 districts. They later edited it in the morning to say that they were only counting in 3 districts, not the 16 previously. They edited the social media post, and then they went to their website where they have the news and announcements, and they posted it there instead of just keeping the original post on Twitter, or sorry, X. And you can see my response to that, confirming that they said that they were going to be counting for an hour 16 districts, and they only counted 3 districts, and they ended up adding at least 57 plus votes in districts that weren't those 3. So that was kind of the first tell.
Let me jump in here before we get bogged down in data. Peter, this sounds like it was just a horribly managed election. What was yours managed beautifully in comparison, or what?
No, not really. We have, I believe, Monday and Tuesday, we have 2 areas that have been contested. The leader of the Liberal Party lost a seat, I think, by 16 votes. So there'll be an official recount in that area and an official recount in another area. But the most dramatic thing is that that the premier claimed that he went to election because he needed a mandate. So we ended up with, I think they've revised the number from 44 to 45% voter turnout. Even if you had 100% of the votes, at 45%, you still don't have a mandate to do much of anything. And he didn't get 100% of the votes, right? A lot of the elections, a lot of the areas were relatively close, but at a 44% voter turnout, no politician can claim a mandate of any kind. You just can't. And so, like I said, there was 66, I believe the number is 66,000 fewer voters. But the other thing that happened in Nova Scotia is Election Nova Scotia also made a catastrophic decision not to send out voter information cards. They were worried about a potential mail strike. Well, they should have sent them out anyways. Everything would have went out before the strike was called. So somebody made a catastrophic error, and a lot of people, even to find out where we wanted to vote or where you were allowed to vote, you had to go online to try to figure out where stuff was. And Nova Scotia gets a lot of older people. I'm actually getting close to that older person category myself. But a lot of people over 70, for example, they didn't even know where to show up and vote. So nothing went as smoothly as it should have went. And the marketing campaign about where to vote was basically an utter failure. It really was. So, there's a number of reasons why we dropped that other 10%. You got to remember, that's a 10% reduction in voters from at the height of COVID, where people flat out didn't want to go out. So a lot of people were really, really put out about what happened to the independent movement here in Nova Scotia. And that combined with the other thing that I find basically in all government departments, and I was in government for 29 years as a game warden, forest firefighter, wildlife specialist. And was just because of DEI policies and new hiring policies over the last, let's say, 15 years, the amount of incompetent people in all levels of government now is actually quite staggering. And some of that was on display yesterday in the courtroom. And I can't get into any of those details, but the things that I'm saying about the level of incompetence it's actually, I really don't know how the country or the provinces function. I have no idea how they can make it work with that many people that shouldn't be in positions of management or actually in positions of management and power trying to get things done.
Ramandit, Peter just alluded to incompetence. That's kind of my question where I'm going with this with you. Is this incompetence or is this malice? Like everyone's talking about these election machines.
People talk about the incompetence, and it's like 100%. I had the 3 phone calls that I had. Each were like 15 minutes each, and I the first one I had, I was talking. I must have gone over the numbers 5 times, and no judgment to this lady, but it's just adding numbers. But she didn't know what I was talking about, and then she talked to the people that counted votes, and they didn't know what I was talking about, and then they asked her supervisor, and her supervisor didn't know what I was talking about. And the same thing happened with my second phone call when I said, hey, you've got these 2,000 votes that disappeared. It's like, oh, we don't know what you're talking about. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that, maybe it was this. And I was just like, okay, I'm going to let you know that I have receipts. So this isn't some sort of conspiracy theory. Like these votes have gone. And so, and his tune kind of changed. He went and talked to his supervisor, and he was just like, okay, we'll send your inquiries to this email address, but just let you know that it was probably this. And it's just like, buddy, okay, you know what? I'll play ball. I'll send the inquiries, and we'll go from there. But I can't square. I mean, it's just like, even if you wanted to make the excuse that it was even mass gross incompetence, let's not lay down on that and just be like, yeah, okay, it was mass gross incompetence. No, that's a problem. Like, we don't want mass gross incompetence when it comes to an election. That's like the one area of like anything that you don't want that. And so it just, when people make that argument online, they're just, oh, it's just incompetence. I'm just like, I don't even know what to say to you, because Yeah.
Well,
I Go
well,
ahead.
actually, payment. I see it as a well-timed combination of both. I see malice mixed in. You can use malice and cover it up by saying people are incompetent, because you only need one person with malicious intent to steer idiots into doing what you want them to do. And you can look at the federal government; it happens every day. And so what
Yeah.
happens is a lot of people actually, maybe deep down, they think they're doing something fine. And it's because maybe they're an idiot, and somebody else with malicious intent has the skill set to get idiots to do things that they want to do that are malicious. That when you actually go in, you look, say, well, no, this is just general incompetence. But general incompetence is always managed by malicious forces behind the scenes.
No, I think you nailed it there, Peter. I mean, that's, and when Anton Bogerman, the CEO of Elections BC, came out and was just like, oh, we hired 17,000 people, human error, maybe, he didn't even definitively say that it was 100% human error and we'll try to rectify it. No, he was just like, it might have been. This whole thing has had vague language, estimated, approximately, might have been weather, might have been human error, you know, uh, roughly 49,000 mail-in ballots, certified envelopes. Now it's more like 65,000. Now it's actually 66,074. And then when you look on their PDF file that they submitted to the public, on the fine print it says subject to change. This is just an estimate. So it's like you can't even get a definitive answer. It's like these are numbers, people. Like do you not have an accountant working for you? Like is there no like guru number cruncher that's going to be saying we have a definitive number of votes, and that was one of my last inquiries that I sent to Elections BC, was just like, you stated that you have this number in your initial count, you have this number of mail-in ballots, add those two numbers, that's what you should get. But they were short 1,800 votes from there in the final count. And it's like, how are you short 1,800 votes? You know how many you have this electronic vote book that has your entire registry of every voter. You should know exactly how many people voted. And so what they buried in their news announcements, and I actually did a video of scrolling down to the very bottom. It was the last sentence that said, and they used the word participated, and that threw me for a loop, because it's like, participated, like that's a little vague. But that number that they put that participated, like the end total, that was 3,464 votes short of the count on the results page. So, and you're not going to get back to me on that. And so that's where that leads me to section 12, where it says the CEO has to notify legitimate inquiries. And so does that mean in that section that describes about penalties and offenses? So is that a lack of due diligence on the CEO, and that he should be put up to an investigation or maybe criminal charges? Because that's interference with the election in my view. But I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know.
So my understanding, Rem, is out in BC, hasn't the provincial election, my understanding is someone is demanding an investigation into foreign country interference in your election.
Oh yeah. I mean, and none of that, it's funny because none of that came out during the election. That came after, I can't remember the exact date. It was like they certified it on the 28th, and then within like, I think closer, but within like a 2-week time frame after that, and maybe the sharer there will see it in the comments. They came out with all this foreign interference and for politicians or bureaucrats that were involved, linked to David Eby, allegedly, and so that, the timing of that And I didn't dive too much in that because I personally couldn't prove it. I could prove the numbers. And you know, and I lost my patience not calling them out hard. But after they told us on the 25th that that portion was 100% complete and that the final vote was 100% complete and it was short, and then they found 2 ballot boxes here, and then they found another ballot box in Prince George McKinney that was 861 votes, and then they come out with a November 5th announcement saying due to I think judge ruling or something, and they just told people November 5th order 12345 has been put into effect. Well, what the hell does that mean? If you hadn't been counting, if you hadn't been screenshotting the results, if you hadn't been adding up the numbers, you would have never known that that order number meant that they had found 748 votes. But they don't put that in detail anywhere. You can't find that anywhere. And so after they turned over Surrey Guildford, with of which the Conservative candidate was leading by 105 votes, and then it got really close, and they miraculously had a data error that flipped the riding. They had a data error of 27, 28 votes, and he won by 22. So once that came out, November 12th, I was just like, screw this.
What party was he with, Rem?
He was Conservative, and it flipped NDP. And that gave them the majority to take a majority government.
So anytime you see something like that happen, down in the U.S., when they had a bunch of serious problems with Dominion voting, when they went back and they started doing all their post-mortem analysis on the data, when you're tampering with elections, flipping votes or doing anything electronically, they try to keep those margins as razor thin as possible, so people wouldn't be able to go back and say, oh, look, this was an obvious cheat. So the question has to be asked, and the question's asked for us. I've had hundreds of people since the election ask me personally, say, is there, who are the people that work over at Elections Nova Scotia? Is there a possibility, even remote, that anybody in there might be compromised by a foreign nation? Because as my background as an investigator, did we lose him?
We lose him. We lost him. Hopefully he'll come back. But
okay.
If you want
to. So anyways, what happened is that I know out in BC is the poster child for the power of the independents. You guys initially out there, I think it was 27 seats, or was it 27 to 26 or 26 to 25, like NDP beating the, ahead of the PC party by 1 seat, and then 2 Green Party seats. I hope BC realizes if you had 4 independents, you'd have your freedom back, because the 4 independents could have matched up and supported, they had done an agreement, matched up with the Conservatives and been able to wrestle freedom back from the NDP party. I mean, the rest of Canada's watching what's happening out in BC, and I mean, it's some of the most destructive things that, people across Canada have to realize. Trump is going to put a 25% tariff on Canada, right? And basically wipe out our economy. And a lot of it is based on things that happen in BC, what happens and flows back and forth across your border out in BC. And, they're not stupid down there. And you got to remember, Trump is a master negotiator. And at the prime ministerial level, our prime minister, he's a simpleton who's simply not qualified to be involved in negotiations of any kind with anybody. And I just want to make a point, too, so that I want to cover myself on this. I can say these things about politics because I'm talking, a lot of this stuff is in my book, as you brought on earlier, the Redneck Conservative. So because that stuff's in my book, that gives me a license politically to say a lot of things that I've discussed in my book without somebody coming back and try to sue me and do that type of stuff. And I think if the prime minister tried to sue me and say that he wasn't a simpleton, that's probably a case I'd win. Just saying. Not trying to. There he's back.
Ramanda joins just as you finished your epic speech.
I so wanted to listen to that. I'm so sorry, it just dropped me.
You were talking about when this happens down south with the Dominion machines. So I
Oh
shouldn't
yeah,
have said that. Electronic
I
machines.
caught yeah, I caught that part.
Peter was
So
saying,
Yeah. So what happens? What happened down there? Like I said, and people even have to look back. There was Dominion voting machines when Andrew Scheer beat the leader of the PPC by like a fraction of 1% in the leadership race. That was Dominion voting machines that were used in that vote. Now, I'm not saying that Dominion voting machines are doing anything criminal. I'm just saying all I ever look at is what we call the preponderance of evidence. And the preponderance of evidence that you look south of the border and what's happening is that anything that's done digitally can be hacked and it cannot be secured. And fine examples in Nova Scotia, Premier Houston, without consent of anybody that voted for him, went and accessed everybody's personal health information and did a deal to give that, to store that in the cloud and give access to what anybody that he calls a designated person can look at anybody in Nova Scotia's private medical history now, and you can't stop them from doing it. And our Auditor General here in Nova Scotia about 3-4 weeks ago come out and said all of our data now is exposed and susceptible to being hacked. And if that's the case with all our private medical data that the government is supposed to be taking care of, I challenge anybody to prove to me that anything digital relating to voting cannot be hacked, because they can't prove it. They're not going to be able to prove it, because if it was built, it can be hacked. So the only way to go back and have just fair elections, or just elections once again, you have to go back to paper ballots only, with scrutineers overlooking them, and the paper ballots get counted one night. There's none of this 2 weeks. There's none of this mail-in voting. There should only be mail-in voting exceptions if you're military overseas. And if you're somebody else and voting's that important to you, you need to get on a plane and come back to the country and vote. Because other than that, the system can be hacked, and human nature being what it is, with the billions and billions of dollars at stake for, I'll give you down here in Nova Scotia, is about 13 to 14 billion dollars at stake annually that we spend. That's a lot of power for people to live up to their human nature. And if they can sway anything in any way, history proves that they will. So I would suggest,
well,
go ahead, Rem.
I was gonna say I mean, we had that here with I think it was Life Labs. They had like I can't remember the number of medical patients they hacked information on. I don't know if it's like 3.2 million patients or whatnot, and then that kind of runs in the case of what you were just talking about. When I was looking back through all the information that the chief electoral officer was affording him, and I think it was actually labeled new powers allow, or new powers given to the chief electoral officer, and it ran through all of this, just basically information, financial reports. That one kind of makes sense, because I mean, you don't want you don't want there to be someone funding someone from whatever kind of foreign interference. I wasn't too upset about that, but it was the medical information part. It's just like they can request your medical information, and all these other things to like look into who you are. And I just found that to be kind of a bit much, especially like when we're going into all this electronic stuff. And so when we look at, and you kind of, you brought it up, was like that fine margin. So there's one of the other guys that I have in my group. He was number crunching, and he ended up coming up with all these graphs. And basically, you can see everything spiking. Every graph has the same spike, and it's basically matched with the NDP and the Conservatives. Everything is just matching. And on election night, it was just weird, because there was just a distance. Like there was an even distance between these two parties, and it doesn't really make sense. And I know that I think the NDP rep or guest on CTV even alluded to that, And I tried to find the clip again. He was just like, "Yeah, this doesn't follow historic trend lines where it just matches every it keeps one party on top." And so that you just kind of see these observations. And so when I went through all 93 ridings, and it was like the last task, like I didn't want to do it because it took like 8 to 10 hours, and I don't have that much time. But I do. And a lot of the stuff I finished at like 3 in the morning, like I did last night for this lady that was requesting some stuff. Anyways, and when I was looking through the 93 ridings, I think it was like 78 of 78 of the 93 ridings, they had the majority. They had the majority of certified envelopes. To the number of 13,000, I think it was 588, compared to the Conservatives, uh, it was like 830. That's a 13 to 1 margin. Um, in mail-in ballots,
Yeah.
more in 78 ridings, like that doesn't even make sense, because you would actually see in, I think it was like 3 or 4 ridings where it was like a super majority Conservative, where there wasn't a lot of like NDP mail-in ballots, where they toppled it with like 90% of the vote. I think that was like Peace River or Powell River or North and South. So when you see the small examples of like the majority of Conservatives, but over the vast set, like 78 ridings, they had on average, what was it was they on average they dropped the Conservative mail-in ballot. It was like 100 on average. NDP had 146 more mail-in ballots. No, it's hard to say because there's so many numbers. I think it was like 178, where they had 178 more ballots in every riding than the Conservatives. And
Yeah, see, if anybody
it's
that
like
understands
nuts.
statistical anomalies, or anybody who does research into that, or anybody who's been an investigator, and you start looking at patterns and you start looking at stuff, what Rem is saying doesn't make any sense unless it was tampered with digitally. I'm just calling it the way it is now.
Yeah.
Now
Well,
here's
that's what gets us into like the tabulators and stuff. But you go ahead, Peter.
one of the other things is after inauguration in the U.S., Trump has an agreement in place that if election interference, if there's election interference in Canada, the U.S., I believe on request, I forget what the name of the legislation is, but they will do or participate in if there's any possibility that there was election interference from a foreign power, that they will participate in an investigation to potentially try to identify that. Because if it can be done up in BC, it can be done down in Oregon. It's only across the border, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
what happens is they look at it as a threat against democracy anywhere, even though they don't have a democracy in the U.S. They have a different system than ours, and then the reality of it is that may be one avenue for the people of BC to look into, because then you're bringing in somebody else who's got no skin in the game, really. You got to remember, everybody who touched this election out in BC, I was watching the numbers going like, man, this thing screams election interference. And I know out there they wanted to go after people in BC who even suggested there might have been, something amiss in the election. They wanted to shut you down on social media. They wanted to levy, what was it, $10,000 fines if you started. Am I right on that? Was somebody was telling me, I thought I read it, there was like $10,000 fines if you were sowing any kind of what they deemed to be misinformation about,
Yeah.
something amiss in the election out there. So as soon as you see that or hear anybody saying that, an investigator goes, okay, that doesn't add up. Something's wrong there. And it's just everything about your election screams election interference.
Yeah. If you read the not you, but if people read the they have the elections BC, they have the information on their website, but you got to find it, you know? And so it's like people reference things like, where'd you find that? And it's just like, oh, you got to go this link, and then that link. And I'm like, holy crap. And so I read their anti-interference, misinformation, disinformation, and I was just like, holy crap, you know, this is why I got to stick to the numbers and what I can prove, because this screams like I could be, you could be charged or penalized. You know, I think it's like 10, a lot of the things are like 10 or $20,000, and
Yeah.
then I think up to 2 years imprisonment. And so I didn't want to step outside of making outright claims because until you can outright prove it, it's kind of you know, if you don't have the smoking gun, then you're kind of putting yourself out there.
Anytime a
Yeah.
government puts any restriction on asking questions, they've got something to hide. I can tell you that from being inside government for 29 years. If any government says you can't, anytime anybody says you can't question this, then 100% they need to be questioned. And when they start
Well,
dumping
get this.
fines on you for questioning, then you really need to start digging, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so I keep finding things, and someone in my group pulled up. It's like there's this. He was like, we should get ready for the EAC, and it's like, what the hell is the EAC? And apparently, it's the Electoral Advisory Committee. First time hearing it. A lot of the stuff is just first time hearing about it. They meet once a year and they sit down with the chief electoral officer, and they basically have questions for him, and they go over things. So I did a post at the very bottom, of the minutes on this. I read they questioned him. I'll paraphrase. Are you willing to hand over any information in regards to foreign interference to any political party? They said political party, but you know, but public too, right? Because the public should know what's going on. And the chief electoral officer said, we've established an interagency connected with the RCMP and CSIS to handle any foreign interference. So if we reference what happened earlier in the summer with the 11 that CSIS had this report on, and nothing's come of it, we don't know who or any of that. Basically, the election BC is operating within itself with this, in quotes, interagency. Like, what does that mean? When does the public get this information? When's this report coming to light? You know, and it just seems like a cover up to just keep the information to yourself, and the public's none the wiser. And so, like, how do you? I can't see. I can't read
Sorry,
that and be like, you've lost my integrity.
Ramanda, I'm just going to jump in here. We've passed the 53-minute mark. So, Peter, keep going, but if we could steer it in
Yeah.
the direction of how this is going to impact the federal election.
I think what's going to happen in the federal election right now, you can't trust the polls. I think the polls are way off. I think Pierre Poilievre's numbers are way higher. I refuse to believe that there's that many people in Canada still support the Liberal and NDP bloc coalition. I just don't believe it. I have to believe that people in Canada cannot possibly be that uneducated and low IQ that they're doing that. And I'm just calling it like I wrote about it in my book. Is the facts are the facts. So here's what I'm hopeful of in the upcoming election. 25% tariff will mean the end of Trudeau because there's not going to be able to deal with it. I think their party will be absolutely crushed, gone. Much like the Liberal Party here in Nova Scotia had 17 seats, they're down to 2 provincially. They get wiped off the map in this election. And to me, a lot of that vote was because half of the people in Nova Scotia still don't differentiate the federal Liberals from the provincial Liberals. Now, the Progressive Conservative Party in Nova Scotia has taken a lot of lengths to separate themselves from the federal Conservatives. But I believe that the federal Liberals will be decimated in the upcoming election to the point, I don't know how they'll be able to retain a seat. The corruption and the incompetence is so mind-boggling, staggering. Earlier today, I was whitetail deer hunting. Maybe that's why I look a little tired, right? I've been on the go here the last month or so. But the reality of it is right now the federal government wants to ban another 330 some, I believe, firearms, then take them from legitimate owners and send them over to Ukraine, which basically says we have people running the government who are so incompetent, so uneducated on warfare and firearms and these things. And they're the people running multi-billion-dollar budgets. And I think across Canada, people are fed up. And the big problem is a lot of people won't go out and vote again, though, like they did in Nova Scotia, because they believe there's no one left to vote for. You've got, a lot of people are looking at the least of, you look at all the four leaders. Right now, it appears the person with the most leadership skills is probably Pierre Poilievre. Trudeau has zero. He has none. And then, I look over at the NDP, and I don't know how the Indians haven't, from India, actually haven't rounded him up and taken him back over there and prosecuted him for supporting, being a terrorist supporter. And then I look at the Bloc Québécois, and they're in it, and rightly so, they're in it for the party from Quebec. And so what happens is a lot of people in Canada, I'm expecting the lowest voter turnout, and I called it in Nova Scotia. I called it's going to be record-breaking low voter turnout. Some of it because of what happened to the independents, and I'm forecasting the next thing here in Canada, because a lot of people are going to throw their hands in the air and say it doesn't matter who we vote. They're all wings of the same bird, but ultimately Trudeau has to go, or we're going to lose this country.
Remanded, I'll put the same question to you, a little bit different flavor. Is the BC what happened sort of a test bed of what they're going to do federally? Was it meant to demoralize people so they don't vote federally?
I think, I mean, this is kind of a hard one to keep kind of short. When I was looking at, I think the BC election is a template for the federal election. And I say that because there's discrepancies in the eligible registered voters at the federal level to the BC level, in the tune of 170 votes, 170,000 too many registered voters at the federal level than with the BC level. And I don't know how that can be, but it's on their website. Just this morning at 6 a.m., Elections Canada posted that they're switching to the electronic voters list, and that's basically what we saw in BC. So, I think we're going to see a lot of the same that we're going to see at the federal level that we did in the BC level. And if they hint or move that this new electronic modernized system is going to be a vote anywhere in Canada, like we had here, vote anywhere in the province, out of district ballots, sound the alarms, because that's a red flag.
All right, we're ending on a cheerful note. I don't know, Peter, anything you want to say that's a little bit optimistic?
Well, I guess let's make it something a little optimistic for myself. Is if you want to know more about what we're doing and get a clear understanding of what our game plan was to give power back to the people, because that option is still there, and that's why we're fighting down here. We're hoping the court overturns the election and forces a new election in July. But if you go read that stuff in my book there on Amazon, that's one of the few things. Buy a copy and send it to one of your redneck friends, because that's something you can still get delivered on Amazon before Christmas. I guarantee they'll be happy that you did it. And unlike a bottle of wine that they might not like, it won't get poured down the sink or thrown in the garbage. Anyways, just saying.
Well, thanks. And Remanded, any last words?
Yeah, we're organizing. I just finished a complete list of the 338 members in the House of Commons, with all their information, Twitter handles, and so there is another group outside of out of mine that will be working actively to promote awareness and get the average citizen, kind of on board and active. So in that regard, we'll be putting it back to the people here in Nova Scotia on hope that turns out for you guys.
All right. Well, time will tell what will happen. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on, and thanks to the audience for watching.
So payment, February 14th, our next court date. Maybe we should get together after that and I'll give you an update.
Sounds good. We'll stay in touch. Best of luck on the court date. And if there's anything else I can do, please reach out.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Bye.